Angstrom thought he could fix everything. After realizing the damage he had done, he tried to make things right, to apologize to Mark, to undo his mistakes. But fate had other plans. His final decision would seal his doom in a way that was shocking, tragic, and the justice he deserved. But his story didn't start with revenge. In fact, Angstrom Levy once hated villains. He was a brilliant scientist who believed in something that most people didn't, the multiverse. He was convinced that there were infinite versions of himself living in different dimensions, each with different experiences, knowledge, and skills. And if he could access all that information, he could become the smartest man in existence. At first, his goal wasn't power or destruction. He truly thought that he could help the world by learning from other versions of himself. He built a machine that could connect his mind to those other Angstroms, gathering all their memories into his own brain. In Invincible Season 2, Episode 4, Angstrom was in the middle of an experiment, with the goal of merging his mind with every version of himself across the multiverse. But to make it work, he needed help. That's where the Mauler twins came in. Except they weren't just the usual Maulers. Angstrom had gathered multiple versions of them from different dimensions to assist with the process. Everything seemed to be going as planned, but then Mark showed up. He had no idea what was really going on. He just saw a dangerous-looking experiment and a bunch of Mauler twins, and assumed he had to stop it. So Mark being Mark, he fought them, and that's where things took a turn for the worse. The Maulers ganged up on Mark, and it quickly became clear that he was outmatched. They overpowered him, beating him to the point to where he was barely hanging on. If someone didn't step in, they were going to kill him. And Angstrom, despite everything, couldn't let that happen. At the last second, he made a split-second decision. He shut down the machine, cutting off the experiment before it could finish. In doing so, he saved Mark's life, but that decision came at a horrible cost. The machine wasn't meant to be stopped mid-process. The sudden shutdown caused a massive energy surge, and instead of smoothly absorbing the knowledge of his alternate selves, Angstrom's brain was overloaded. His head grotesquely mutated, stretching and deforming as his mind was flooded with endless thoughts, memories, and experiences from countless versions of himself. Angstrom was in agony. He could hear everything, feel everything, and there was no way to control it. It was too much for any human to handle, and in that moment, something inside him snapped. Instead of blaming himself for what happened, he needed someone else to take the fall, and the only person he could focus on was Mark Grayson. If Mark hadn't intervened, the experiment wouldn't have gone wrong. If Mark had just stayed out of it, he wouldn't be in this never-ending nightmare. From that moment on, Angstrom Levy was no longer a scientist with good intentions. He became something else entirely. A man with one goal: making Mark Grayson suffer. To get back at Mark, he used his knowledge of the multiverse to bring evil versions of Invincible into his world. He wanted Mark to suffer, to fight against twisted versions of himself, and to destroy everything he cared about. Angstrom was no longer the man he used to be. He had become what he once hated: a villain. And in the end, that's exactly what would ultimately lead to his downfall. Angstrom Levy, now obsessed with ruining Mark's life, had planned the Invincible War, unleashing countless evil versions of Mark from different dimensions to tear the world apart. He tracked down the most brutal versions of Mark from across the multiverse, the ones that had already destroyed everything in their path and embraced their darkest sides. Then, he sent them all to Earth. What followed was a nightmare. These evil versions of Mark tore through cities, taking down heroes one by one. But things didn't go as Angstrom expected. The Twisted Invincibles turned on him later on, and instead of following his lead, they started fighting him too, trying to take over the whole situation. In the end, Angstrom had no choice but to send them all to another dimension, hoping to salvage what was left of his plan. But it was a complete failure. Mark and his family were still alive, and Earth wasn't broken the way he had hoped. After their battle, Angstrom had lost track of Mark. For a while, he believed Mark might actually be dead. However, it wasn't until later that he learned the truth. Mark was alive, and worse, he had moved on with his life. That realization reignited his rage, pushing him to do something even more personal and cruel. And what better way to do it than to attack the person Mark loved the most? Angstrom traveled to Mark's house, where he found Eve, pregnant and completely vulnerable. He wasted no time, ambushing her, ready to make Mark suffer in the worst way imaginable. He knew that if he could take Eve and their unborn child away, Mark would never recover. But before he could do the job, Mark found out and rushed to stop him. Angstrom, however, had planned for this. The moment Mark arrived, he opened a portal and sent him to another dimension, one that Mark had no way of escaping. Stranded in an unfamiliar world, Mark quickly realized he wasn't alone. He found a group of abandoned Invincible variants, remnants of the Invincible War, left behind after Angstrom no longer had a use for them. Some had given up hope, others had turned against each other, and one in particular stood out, the version with a mohawk. Mohawk Mark had been there longer than most and had learned to survive. He wasn't exactly a good guy, but he wasn't willing to die in that wasteland either. Seeing an opportunity, Mark convinced him to work together. If they wanted to escape, they needed each other. Meanwhile, back on Earth, Eve did something no one expected. Instead of fighting Angstrom, she reasoned with him. She forced him to see the truth, that everything he had done was based on a lie, that his obsession had destroyed him more than Mark ever could. For the first time in years, Angstrom actually listened. Realizing the horror of what he had become, he made a decision. He opened a portal to bring Mark back, determined to make things right. But just as Mark was about to step through, Mohawk Mark saw his chance. Instead of letting Angstrom undo his mistakes, Mohawk Mark attacked him. He didn't care about apologies or redemption. He only saw Angstrom as a reason for his suffering. He lunged at him, ready to kill. Angstrom panicked and, desperate to fix things, opened another portal for Mohawk Mark to return home. It was his final attempt to make amends, a way to free someone he had wronged. But Mohawk Mark wasn't in a forgiving mood. Instead of taking the offer, he grabbed Angstrom and dragged him through the portal with him. No one knew where they went. No one was sure if Angstrom was alive. It seemed like the story had ended there, but it didn't. Robot wasn't satisfied with leaving things to change. He needed to know if Angstrom was still a threat. Using his advanced technology, he tracked the portal's destination and sent Mark there to investigate. When Mark arrived, he found a nightmare. Mohawk Mark continued his experiments on Angstrom, pushing his powers to their limits. He had become obsessed with controlling the multiverse and believed Angstrom was the key. The scientist who once sought knowledge and power was now nothing more than a tool, a prisoner subjected to endless torture. But his suffering didn't last much longer. Robot had no interest in drawn-out revenge or emotional closure. He saw Angstrom as a loose end, a problem that needed to be erased. Coldly, efficiently, he finished the job. Angstrom Levy, the man who once believed he could control fate itself, died. Not in battle, not in a blaze of glory, but as a forgotten prisoner, completely powerless. A fitting end for someone who thought he could play God. But still, the question is Angstrom actually the villain? Or is he just a villain in the eyes of Invincible, where Invincible himself is the true villain? If you really think about it, Angstrom Levy wasn't a bad person before Mark stepped in and ruined his experiment. He had good intentions. He wanted to merge the knowledge of all his variants to make the world a better place. He wasn't a conqueror, a warlord, or a power-hungry monster like the Viltrumites. He was just a man who saw an opportunity to use the multiverse for good. But all that changed when Mark unknowingly turned his life into a nightmare. Mark's interference caused the experiment to go horribly wrong, leaving Angstrom's mind shattered and his body deformed with that big-ass forehead. The very thing that was supposed to make him the smartest being across realities instead broke his mind, filling it with countless conflicting memories and pushing him to the brink of insanity. And from Angstrom's perspective, Mark was the reason for his suffering. Mark was the villain in his story. So, do you think Angstrom is the actual villain? Or a broken hero?